Hello, I'm Rahul, and this is HOA Case Lab, bringing you intense HOA cases, conflicts, and revenge twists. In neighborhoods like this, the smallest piece of land can turn into a battlefield, and that was exactly what happened when a simple patch of grass became the center of an all-out HOA nightmare. It started with something so ordinary that no one would believe it could escalate into a revenge story that would shake the entire community. Dogs kept walking across one homeowner's lawn day after day, leaving behind damage, mess, and disrespect, while the owners acted like the rules did not apply to them. What makes this story wild is not just the behavior, but the response, because instead of yelling, arguing, or filing endless complaints, the homeowner chose something calculated, quiet, and devastatingly effective. Bro, when you hear how this unfolded, it feels like something straight out of a viral Reddit thread. But this wasn't Taishan. It was strategy, and the way it ended, let's just say the lawn would never be the same again. 2. The neighborhood had always presented itself as orderly and well managed, the kind of place where lawns were trimmed in straight lines, trash bins disappeared promptly after collection, and the HOA newsletter felt more like a rule book than a friendly update. The homeowner who became the center of this story had moved in expecting stability, not conflict. The house itself was modest but clean, and the front yard was its pride and joy. Fresh sod had been installed shortly after moving in, carefully leveled and watered daily, creating a smooth green surface that reflected both investment and intention. It wasn't just grass, it represented a fresh start after years of renting and dealing with unpredictable living conditions. For the first few weeks, everything felt peaceful. Neighbors maintained polite distance. Morning routines blended quietly into one another. The street had that calm, suburban rhythm that makes people believe problems only happen elsewhere. And that illusion began to crack when the lawn started showing faint signs of repeated foot traffic. At first, the homeowner assumed it was accidental, a delivery person, cutting corners, a child running across, nothing alarming. But then the pattern became impossible to ignore. The same diagonal track formed across the yard from the sidewalk corner toward the driveway edge. It wasn't random, it was intentional. And the reason became obvious when the homeowner noticed neighbors walking their dogs using that exact shortcut every day. Instead of staying on the sidewalk, they were crossing directly over the property. The dogs followed, paws pressing into the soft soil, and soon the grass along that path began thinning. What made things worse was not just the walking itself, but the lack of responsibility from some of the dog owners. After the dogs did their business on the lawn, cleanup was inconsistent. Some neighbors would pause briefly and continue, without addressing it. 3. The homeowner would find small patches of damage and unpleasant residue, especially after weekends when foot traffic increased. The once uniform lawn started developing uneven patches. The soil compacted in high-traffic areas, preventing proper growth. Watering became less effective because the root system was repeatedly disturbed. It was slow damage, not dramatic destruction, which made it harder to prove as a single incident. That's exactly how these situations spiral in real life. Not one big event, but dozens of small ones stacking up. The homeowner attempted to address the issue calmly. Small signs were placed near the edge of the yard, politely stating that the lawn was private property and requesting that neighbors use the sidewalk. The tone was respectful, not aggressive. For a brief period, there was improvement. A few neighbors adjusted their route, but the shortcut quickly returned. Some residents seemed to treat the lawn as if it were an informal community walkway, as though convenience outweighed ownership. The signs began disappearing one by one. Whether removed intentionally or damaged by weather was unclear, but the result was the same. The path remained active. Frustration grew, but the homeowner avoided confrontation. Instead of knocking on doors, they documented the issue. Photos were taken of the worn track, dates were noted, the pattern became undeniable, and when the damage worsened, the homeowner contacted the HOA management, expecting support. The association responded formally, explaining that while private property boundaries were respected, enforcement between neighbors required formal procedures and sufficient evidence. They advised filing complaints if violations occurred, but clarified that simple crossing without explicit posted restrictions did not automatically trigger penalties. 4. The response felt neutral, almost dismissive. It wasn't that the HOA supported the behavior, but rather that they treated it as low priority. Hearing that kind of bureaucratic answer can feel discouraging. That's how systems often operate: slow, procedural, and emotionally detached. The homeowner tried to explore other preventative options. Temporary fencing was considered, but HOA guidelines restricted certain visual barriers that altered the neighborhood's aesthetic uniformity. Permanent fencing required approval and compliance with design standards, which could involve lengthy review. Motion-activated sprinklers were examined as a deterrent, but concerns about water usage and potential spray onto sidewalks complicated the idea. Even decorative garden borders faced scrutiny under appearance guidelines. It seemed like every solution either risked a violation or required prolonged approval processes. Meanwhile, the lawn continued to deteriorate along the established path. During this period, something important happened. Instead of reacting impulsively, the homeowner began observing the behavior more closely. The crossing was predictable. It occurred during specific times, morning and evening walks, especially on weekends. The dogs and owners followed identical entry and exit points. The consistency revealed something powerful. This wasn't random inconvenience, it was habit, and habits can be redirected. The homeowner realized that arguing about behavior might lead to tension but wouldn't necessarily stop it. The neighbors viewed the shortcut as harmless. From their perspective, it saved time and didn't appear to cause immediate harm. Because the damage was gradual, many probably didn't connect their actions to the lawn's condition. That's a common psychological blind spot. People often underestimate the cumulative impact of small actions. When the consequences are delayed or shared across many individuals. 5. So instead of escalating emotionally, the homeowner began thinking structurally. If the space was being treated as a pathway, perhaps it needed to be redesigned as one. The lawn's purpose was aesthetic and residential. But if its current design invited repeated disruption, then functionality might need to change. This wasn't about revenge yet. It was about solving a recurring maintenance problem in a way that would align with HOA rules while eliminating the root cause. The key was compliance. Any change would need to fit within regulations, so it couldn't be challenged easily. Consultations began with landscaping professionals. Conversations focused on durability, long-term cost efficiency, drainage, and low-maintenance alternatives. The homeowner explained the recurring foot traffic issue without framing it as a conflict, instead presenting it as a practical landscaping challenge. One suggestion stood out: replacing vulnerable turf in high-traffic zones with hardscape materials. Gravel, stone, or decorative rock could create a defined visual element while preventing compaction and damage. From a maintenance perspective, it made sense. Rocks do not suffer from paw prints. They do not die from soil compaction. They do not require weekly repair. The more the homeowner considered it, the clearer the logic became. The damaged area already required constant attention. Water bills were increasing due to repeated attempts to revive the grass. Fertilizer applications were less effective because the root system could not stabilize. Instead of continuing a losing battle, converting the path area into a landscape stone feature would permanently address the issue. It would also visually signal that the area was intentional and not meant for walking. 6. The homeowner carefully reviewed HOA guidelines before proceeding. There was no restriction against decorative stone landscaping, as long as drainage was maintained and the appearance was consistent with community standards. Modifications were permitted. That discovery was critical. It meant the solution could not easily be reversed by complaint. The decision was made calmly. There would be no announcement, no confrontation, no heated meetings. The transformation would happen quietly and professionally. The damaged grass section was scheduled for removal. Soil preparation would follow. Landscaping fabric would be installed to prevent weeds. Then, durable decorative rocks would replace the vulnerable turf in. The exact diagonal zone where the shortcut existed. As plans moved forward, the homeowner remained discreet. There was no public debate, no social media posts, no dramatic warnings. The approach was simple: solve the problem at its source. If people continued to use the area as a path, they would soon discover that it no longer functioned as one. The solution would not rely on enforcement or arguments. It would rely on design. And that decision set the stage for everything that followed, because once the rocks were installed, the neighborhood dynamics would change permanently. What had been a soft shortcut would soon become a structured boundary. The lawn would no longer invite casual crossing. Instead, it would quietly communicate a new reality, one built not on anger, but on strategy. The landscaping work didn't happen dramatically or overnight in a way that would draw immediate attention. It unfolded in stages, which made it feel almost routine to anyone glancing at the property from the street. First, the worn diagonal section of grass was clearly marked off for renovation. Then the turf was carefully removed, revealing compacted soil beneath, evidence of months of repeated foot traffic. And that alone told a story without a single word being spoken. 7. The homeowner didn't post warnings or make announcements. The project looked like standard property maintenance, nothing more. Once the grass was cleared, the ground was leveled and improved for drainage. A professional-grade landscaping fabric was installed across the entire high-traffic strip, secured tightly to prevent shifting. This step wasn't decorative, it was foundational. It ensured that whatever was placed on top would remain stable and low maintenance. Then came the stone layer. The rocks were not random gravel thrown together quickly. They were selected carefully for consistency in size, color harmony with the home's exterior, and compliance with neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. The final result looked intentional, structured, and clean. From the sidewalk, it appeared as a thoughtful design feature rather than a reaction. That was important. Nothing about the installation violated HOA standards. There were no height restrictions breached, no permanent structures erected, no changes to property boundaries. It was simply a landscaping update, and because it fit within regulations, there was no immediate grounds for the HOA to demand removal. When neighbors first noticed the transformation, reactions varied. Some paused in confusion, clearly recognizing that the familiar shortcut was gone. Others seemed mildly irritated, especially those who had grown accustomed to the convenience. But there was no open confrontation. The homeowner remained calm, continuing daily routines as if nothing significant had happened. That silence carried weight. It sent a subtle message. The property was being managed with intention. The real impact became obvious during the next routine dog walking hours. As expected, several residents approached the usual diagonal entry point. However, instead of soft grass beneath their feet, there was now uneven stone. Dogs hesitated. Owners slowed down. The surface was no longer comfortable for casual crossing. 8. The shortcut required effort, balance, and attention. It disrupted the flow that had previously made it attractive. Within days, behavior began to shift. Some residents rerouted onto the sidewalk without comment. Others tried briefly to navigate the rocks, but quickly abandoned the attempt due to inconvenience. The pathway effect was dissolving naturally. No signs were needed. No arguments were required. The environment itself enforced the boundary. What made this escalation powerful was not hostility, but inevitability. The rocks didn't attack anyone. They didn't escalate emotions. They simply removed convenience. And convenience had been the only reason the shortcut existed in the first place. Once that incentive disappeared, so did the behavior. For the homeowner, this phase was both satisfying and validating. The lawn damage stopped almost immediately. There were no more worn patches forming, no further soil compaction, no visible paw print trails cutting across the yard. The maintenance burden decreased significantly. Water usage stabilized. The property began to recover visually and structurally. But the real escalation wasn't physical. It was psychological. Neighbors who had previously treated the lawn casually were now forced to recognize the boundary in a tangible way. The redesign changed the social dynamic of the street. It communicated that the property owner was observant, patient, and willing to solve problems permanently rather than temporarily, and that understanding would soon influence how the entire community responded. Next, the climax of this story didn't arrive with shouting or dramatic confrontations. It arrived quietly, in the everyday routines of the neighborhood, when the reality of the new landscaping fully set in. The rocks were not a temporary deterrent. They were permanent, stable, and completely aligned with HOA regulations. 9. There was no rule that required grass in that section, no clause preventing decorative stone, and no technical violation to challenge. That legal clarity made the transformation untouchable. The first real test happened during the usual morning dog walking hour. Several neighbors instinctively approached the old diagonal entry point out of habit. Habits are powerful, and breaking them is never instant. But when the dogs stepped toward the yard, the change in surface was immediate and undeniable. Instead of soft turf, there was structured stone underfoot. The dogs slowed down. Some refused to continue. Owners had to adjust their path in real time. The shortcut that once saved seconds now required careful footing and extra effort. In a suburban environment where convenience drives behavior, even small inconveniences matter. Over the next few days, the pattern became clear. The lawn was no longer being crossed. The rocks had effectively redirected traffic back to the sidewalk without confrontation, without fines. And without formal disputes, the behavior stopped. That is the kind of outcome most HOA conflicts fail to achieve. The homeowner didn't have to argue about boundaries because the landscape now defined them. What made this moment feel powerful wasn't aggression, it was precision. The homeowner had identified the exact entry and exit points and redesigned only that specific strip. The rest of the yard remained intact and visually appealing. This targeted approach prevented accusations of overreaction. It was proportional, thoughtful, and grounded in practical reasoning. Some neighbors initially expressed confusion, but confusion is not a violation. There was no official complaint that could stand. The HOA inspected the modification and confirmed compliance. Because the change improved drainage and reduced erosion, it could even be framed as environmentally responsible. That technical legitimacy closed the door on reversal attempts. As weeks passed, the transformation proved its effectiveness. No more compacted soil, no more damaged grass, no more inconsistent cleanup issues from dogs crossing the property. The maintenance burden dropped significantly. The homeowner no longer spent weekends repairing turf or reseeding patches. The lawn regained its intended appearance, and the property value benefited from the improved landscaping structure. The psychological impact was subtle but real. The neighbors learned that shortcuts across private property would not always remain convenient. The homeowner had not escalated emotionally. Instead, they had responded with design. And design is far harder to challenge than words. In conflicts like this, silence paired with strategic action often creates the strongest outcome. That was the climax. Not revenge in the traditional sense, but a permanent boundary established through compliance, patience, and structural change. The rocks did not just replace grass, they replaced the entire dynamic of the situation. And once the shortcut disappeared, the conflict effectively ended. After the rocks were installed and the routine shortcut disappeared, the neighborhood slowly settled into a new normal. There were no dramatic meetings, no formal disputes escalating through the HOA system, and no further attempts to challenge the landscaping change. The homeowner continued maintaining the property calmly, treating the stone area as a permanent design feature rather than a statement. Over time, the absence of foot traffic allowed the rest of the lawn to recover naturally. The grass grew thicker, healthier, and more consistent because it was no longer being compressed by daily crossings. 11. The HOA eventually shifted focus to other community matters, as associations often do when a situation does not present a clear rule violation. Since the modification complied with guidelines, there was no procedural leverage to reverse it. That compliance became the key to long-term stability. It wasn't about winning an argument, it was about eliminating the conditions that created the problem in the first place. Once the shortcut stopped functioning, the issue effectively dissolved. Interestingly, the rocks began to be seen differently over time. What some neighbors initially viewed as an inconvenience gradually blended into the visual landscape of the street. Decorative stone is common in many suburban designs, and because the installation looked intentional and professionally done, it didn't appear disruptive. Visitors who were unaware of the backstory simply assumed it was part of the original plan, and that perception helped normalize the change. The homeowner also experienced a significant reduction in stress. There were no more daily concerns about lawn damage, no need to monitor foot traffic, and no repeated frustration about cleanup issues. The property felt respected again. That sense of restored boundaries brought a quiet satisfaction, not loud satisfaction, not dramatic celebration, just calm reassurance that the space was being treated appropriately. Over months, The story became less about conflict and more about adaptation. Neighbors adjusted their walking routes without complaint. Dogs followed the sidewalks as intended. The diagonal path faded from memory because it no longer offered any advantage. The rocks remained stable, clean, and low maintenance, proving that the decision had been practical as well as strategic. 12 in the end, the resolution wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about designing a solution that prevented future problems. The homeowner had chosen patience over confrontation and structure over emotion. And that choice led to a permanent fix that required no ongoing battles. The lawn was restored, the rules were respected, and the situation concluded without escalation beyond landscaping. Sometimes the most effective resolution is the one that quietly makes the problem impossible to continue. This story hits differently because it shows how conflict doesn't always require confrontation to be resolved. In HOA environments especially, emotions can escalate fast, but strategic thinking often creates stronger results than arguments ever could. The homeowner didn't break rules, didn't create drama, and didn't turn the situation into a public war. Instead, they studied the pattern, understood the system, and made a change that solved the root cause permanently. That's the kind of quiet revenge that feels satisfying without crossing ethical lines. Bro, this is exactly why stories like this go viral. Because they reflect real neighborhood dynamics people experience every day. When boundaries are ignored, solutions don't always come from enforcement. Sometimes they come from redesign. And when that redesign is compliant, thoughtful, and permanent, there's nothing left to fight. It's a reminder that patience, observation, and structure can be more powerful than anger in almost any community conflict. 13. If you enjoyed this HOA-style revenge story, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more real-life inspired narratives from the world of property drama, malicious compliance, and pro-revenge. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have done in this situation. Would you have confronted the neighbors, escalated through the HOA, or redesigned the yard like this? Your stories might even get featured in a future episode. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss the next dramatic neighborhood showdown. More stories are coming soon.